The conference room at Sinclair Aerospace went silent the moment the toolbox hit the table. Mason Walker set it down without a sound the way he did everything, and began placing his instruments back inside it one by one. A torque wrench, a set of calipers, a battered notebook held together with a rubber band. 12 executives sat frozen around the glass table, and at the head of it stood Evelyn Sinclair, 34 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's history, her jaw tight with the kind of fury that comes from being challenged in front of people she needed to impress. She had just finished saying 5 words to him, flat and final, the same 5 words she'd used on a dozen engineers before him. Do as I said, or quit. She expected him to fold, the way the others always had. Instead, Mason zipped the toolbox closed, tucked his laptop under one arm, lifted his coffee mug, chipped, printed with a crayon drawing of a stick figure family that his 8-year-old daughter Chloe had made for him, and walked toward the door. He paused there, just long enough to look back once, not with anger, only with something that looked almost like pity. "Good luck launching," he said quietly, "without the only engineer who actually understands your prototype." Then he was gone, and the boardroom doors closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. To find out how a quiet man in a borrowed consulting badge brought a billion-dollar aerospace launch to its knees in one afternoon, and what it cost the woman who fired him to earn him back. Stay until the very end. If you have ever sat in a room and watched someone senior take credit for work they didn't understand, or watched a good man get talked over because he wasn't loud enough to defend himself, you already know the shape of this story, and I'd love to hear in the comments if it's happened to you too. Because so many of you watching have lived exactly this. There's an old argument that never quite goes away in workplaces like this one, whether loyalty to the people who actually build a company should outweigh the hunger for growth that drives it, or whether a company has the right to treat its builders as replaceable the moment they become inconvenient. And Mason's story sits right in the middle of that fight, though neither he nor Evelyn realized it yet. 3 years ago, none of this existed. There was no Sinclair Aerospace prototype worth $240 million in investor commitments, no launch date circled in red on 100 calendars, and no reason for a billionaire CEO and a widowed single father to ever occupy the same room. 3 years ago, Mason Walker was simply a man raising his daughter alone in a small rented house on the edge of Millbrook, 40 minutes outside the city, doing HVAC repair and the occasional contract inspection job. The kind of work nobody remembers the name of the person who did it. He hadn't always lived that small. Before Chloe was born, before the accident that took his wife Sarah on a rain-slicked overpass on a Tuesday night 3 winters ago, Mason Walker had been one of the top propulsion systems engineers in the country, the kind of mind that aerospace recruiters fought over, the kind of name that used to appear on patent filings before he asked quietly for it to stop. After Sarah died, he stopped answering recruiter calls entirely. He took Chloe out of daycare and put himself in the kitchen instead of the lab, learned to braid hair badly, and then, learned which stuffed rabbit could not be left behind at school under any circumstances, and told himself that being ordinary and present beat being brilliant and absent. He never explained this to anyone at work. It wasn't their business, and explaining it always seemed to invite pity he didn't want. So he simply let people believe what they wanted to believe, that he was a competent but unremarkable contractor who fixed things and didn't say much. Sinclair Aerospace needed a temporary propulsion consultant that spring because their permanent lead, a polished, quick-talking engineer named Derek Ross, had convinced the board that the prototype's persistent thermal instability issue was nearly solved, when in fact he had been quietly papering over a flaw he didn't fully understand. Derek was the kind of man who filled every silence with confidence, who used the phrase "at the end of the day" so often that the interns kept a tally. and who had built his reputation less on what he knew than on how certain he sounded saying it. When the temp agency sent over Mason's resume, thin on recent titles, thick on a decade-old NASA subcontract nobody at Sinclair bothered to read closely, Derek didn't feel threatened. He assumed, the way people like Derek always do, that a man willing to take a short-term consulting gig at his rate must not have much else going for him. Evelyn Sinclair had inherited controlling interest in the company from her father 2 years earlier, at 32, and had spent every day since proving to a boardroom full of men twice her age that she deserved the seat. She had built her leadership style around a single unbending principle: authority, once given, must never be questioned in front of others, because the moment it was, in her mind, the whole structure of trust beneath her began to crack. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was fear wearing the costume of control. She had $240 million in investor commitments, riding on a launch date 11 weeks away, a board that had begun murmuring about her age and her nerve in equal measure, and a father's legacy she was terrified of being the one who lost. When Derek told her the thermal issue was essentially handled, she believed him, because believing him was easier than doubting the one person who kept telling her everything would be fine. Mason showed up on his first day in a gray collared shirt and steel-toed boots, said perhaps 11 words to anyone before lunch, and spent his first 3 hours simply reading the thermal test logs, line by line, while the rest of the propulsion team assumed he was falling behind. He wasn't falling behind. He was finding the fracture in the data that Derek had missed 8 months earlier, buried in a column of numbers nobody had cross-referenced against ambient humidity. He said nothing about it that day. He had learned the hard way that being right too loudly, too fast, in a room that didn't yet trust him, rarely ended well for the quiet man in the room. He would learn that lesson again before this was over. And so would Evelyn Sinclair, the woman who was about to make the biggest mistake, and eventually the bravest correction of her professional life. The first real trouble started 4 weeks in on a Thursday morning that began like any other and ended with Mason Walker standing in front of the full executive board, watching a room decide, without knowing it was doing so, exactly how much a quiet man's expertise was worth. Mason had gone to Derek privately first, the way he always tried to do things. No audience, no embarrassment. Just a folder of data laid flat on Derek's desk, showing that the thermal regulator's failure point wasn't a manufacturing tolerance issue, as Derek had told the board, but a design flaw in the coolant channel geometry itself, a flaw that would only get worse as the prototype scaled toward full-thrust testing. Derek had looked at the folder for exactly 4 seconds before closing it. "We're 2 weeks from a milestone review," he'd said. "And you want me to walk in and tell Evelyn Sinclair the whole design is wrong because a temp with an 11-year-old NASA credit says so?" He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. He simply filed the folder under a stack of other folders and told Mason, not unkindly, to focus on his assigned tasks and let the systems team handle systems-level concerns. Mason let it go for 6 days. The way a man who has spent 3 years choosing his daughter's bedtime over his own pride learns to let almost everything go. But on the 7th day, a low-pressure test run produced a coolant flare that came within, by Mason's later calculation, roughly 90 seconds of a containment breach in the test bay, and 3 technicians were still inside the perimeter when it happened. Nobody was hurt. But Mason had had enough of quietly waiting to be believed, and he requested 5 minutes at the next board update. A request Derek couldn't easily refuse without looking like he was hiding something. He got his 5 minutes. He used 4 of them, showing, plainly and without a single wasted word, the coolant channel geometry problem, the humidity-correlated failure data, and a proposed redesign that would cost 11 days and roughly $40,000 to implement. It was, by any honest measure in that room, one of the most precise and complete pieces of engineering testimony anyone there had heard in months. And it was also in front of 6 board members. Evelyn Sinclair was actively trying to reassure about her competence 11 weeks before a launch, an admission that the story she'd been telling investors, that the hard problems were solved, was false. She didn't yell. That was almost the worst part, several people in that room would say later. She simply looked at Mason, her voice level and cold, and told him that Sinclair Aerospace didn't need a consultant, undermining the lead engineer's authority in front of the board 11 weeks before launch. That if he had concerns, they belonged in a private channel, not a public one, and that going forward he would defer to Derek's design calls without further editorializing. When Mason, calm as ever, said only that the containment risk made silence the wrong call, Evelyn cut him off with the 5 words that would end up costing her company 11 days of production and very nearly her entire launch window. Do as I said or quit. There's a version of this argument that plays out in almost every trade in this country, whether it's the factory floor or the operating room or the classroom. Whether a lifetime of hands-on, hard-won experience deserves more trust than a fresh diploma and a confident voice, or whether credentials and polish should always outrank the quiet competence of the person who's simply been doing the work longest. And if you've ever watched a younger, louder colleague get believed over someone who actually knew better, I'd be curious whether you think Mason should have pushed harder sooner, or whether staying quiet as long as he could was the only way a single father protects the paycheck his daughter depends on. Mason didn't argue. He'd learned that arguing with someone who has already decided not to hear you rarely changes anything except how much dignity you get to keep on the way out. He packed his toolbox. He said his one line about the prototype in the door. And by 5 o'clock that evening, Sinclair Aerospace head of HR was already drafting the paperwork to formally end his short-term consulting contract. Effective immediately, no severance owed, no exit interview requested. Derek told 2 colleagues privately that it was honestly a relief. And within a week, most of the propulsion team had quietly stopped mentioning Mason's name at all. The way people do when they've decided it's safer not to have an opinion about something the boss has already closed the book on. Nobody at Sinclair Aerospace that Thursday evening understood what had actually just walked out the door with him. Not the coolant channel fix, not the redesign math, and not the one piece of undocumented, unrecorded knowledge that existed nowhere but inside Mason Walker's head. The precise calibration sequence that made the prototype secondary thermal sensor array function correctly. A sequence he had built from scratch in his first 3 weeks and never gotten around to writing into the official documentation because nobody had asked him to, and because he'd assumed, wrongly, that he'd still be there to run it himself. 2 weeks would pass in uneasy, overconfident quiet before that missing piece revealed itself. And when it did, it would not reveal itself gently. 14 days after Mason Walker cleaned out his desk, the prototype went dark during a scheduled pre-launch thermal calibration, and it did not come back on for 6 hours. It wasn't dramatic in the way explosions are dramatic. It was worse in the specific way engineering failures are worse. A quiet, total silence where data should have been. A secondary sensor array returning nothing but flat, useless zeros, and an entire calibration team standing around a console at 11 at night, with no idea why a system that had worked flawlessly under Mason's watch had simply stopped speaking to them the moment he was no longer the one running it. Derek spent 4 hours trying every documented procedure he had, and every one of them failed, because the actual working sequence had never made it into any document at all. By morning, Sinclair Aerospace had lost an estimated $1.6 million in scheduling penalties, a full week of the launch runway. And, worse, in Evelyn's eyes, The confidence of two lead investors who had flown in specifically to watch that calibration succeed. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She sat alone in her office long after the building had emptied, replaying the boardroom scene on a loop she couldn't stop. And, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, she let herself sit with a feeling she usually outran through sheer motion. The cold, specific suspicion that she had been wrong, and that being wrong in front of her board hadn't been the real mistake. Silencing the one person who'd tried to warn her had been. The confirmation came from an unexpected place. Priya Anand, a junior systems analyst who had sat quietly through that fateful board meeting and who had spent every day since privately reviewing the coolant channel data Mason had presented, finally worked up the nerve to bring Evelyn a full timeline. The original flaw, Derek's dismissal of it, Mason's private warning 6 days before the board meeting, and the near miss in the test bay that had actually prompted him to speak up in the first place. Priya had known fragments of this for 2 weeks and had said nothing, afraid of being seen as disloyal to Derek, who was, after all, still her direct supervisor. What finally moved her to speak wasn't ambition. It was watching a good man get blamed, in whispers around the office, for a failure his own missing knowledge had predicted almost to the day. "He tried to tell us," Priya said simply, sliding the folder across Evelyn's desk. "He tried to tell us twice." Evelyn read every page twice. Then she did something none of her board members expected, and none of them would have advised. She got in her car that same afternoon, without an assistant, without a press handler, and drove 40 minutes to a small rented house on the edge of Millbrook. She almost didn't get out of the car. Through the front window, she could see Mason at the stove, sleeves rolled up, laughing at something his daughter Chloe was saying. From her stool at the counter, the girl's hands covered in flour, a crayon drawing of the same stick figure family from the coffee mug taped crookedly to the refrigerator behind them. It was such an ordinary scene, and it undid something in Evelyn that $240 million of investor pressure never had. She had spent weeks thinking of Mason Walker as a line item, a consulting contract, a problem she'd solved by removing him from a room. Watching him through that window, she understood for the first time that she had never once, in 4 weeks, asked him a single question about who he actually was. She knocked. Chloe answered before Mason could, flour on her nose, entirely unbothered by the stranger in a blazer on the porch, and called back over her shoulder, "Dad, it's the lady from your work, the mean one." Mason appeared behind her, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and said nothing for a long moment, long enough that Evelyn had time to feel every ounce of the awkwardness she deserved to feel. When he finally spoke, it wasn't triumphant, it was tired. "I'm not coming back to be humiliated a second time," he said, "and I'm not interested in a bigger paycheck to make this go away quietly." Evelyn, for the first time in longer than she could remember, didn't lead with a counteroffer or a title. She asked instead if she could sit down, and there, at a kitchen table with a highlights magazine and a half-finished puzzle still on it, she told him the truth. That she'd been wrong, that the company was in real trouble, and that she didn't fully understand yet why she had reacted to him the way she had. There would have been a simpler ending here if the company's troubles had stopped at one bad calibration night. They didn't. Within another 10 days, a second and far more dangerous problem would surface, one involving Derek Ross, a set of altered test logs, and a discovery that would force Evelyn to choose between protecting the story she'd told her board and protecting the truth Mason had been trying to hand her from the very beginning. 10 days would pass before that choice arrived at her door, and when it did, it would not wait for her to be ready. The altered logs surfaced almost by accident. Priya, still quietly digging through the archived test data to understand exactly how the original thermal flaw had been resolved on paper months earlier, noticed that 3 specific data points from the original failure report had been edited after the fact, not deleted. just subtly adjusted, softened, moved just far enough inside acceptable tolerance to make an unsafe reading look survivable. The edits traced back to a login timestamp 8 months old, on the night before Derek's original problem-solved presentation to the board. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, made under pressure, by a man who had convinced himself that confidence would carry him across a gap that competence should have closed instead. Evelyn called Mason before she confronted Derek, which surprised even her. She didn't ask him to come back as a favor. She laid out exactly what Priya had found and asked him, directly, what it would take, not in salary, but in conditions, for him to be willing to look at the prototype again, on his terms, with real authority this time instead of borrowed authority he had to fight for every day. Mason thought about it overnight, made dinner, walked Chloe through her spelling words, and called Evelyn back the next morning, with 3 conditions instead of 1. Full technical authority over propulsion decisions, without needing sign-off from someone who didn't understand the system. A written acknowledgement in the official incident file that his original warning had been correct and dismissed, and a hard rule, going forward, that no engineer at Sinclair Aerospace would ever again be told to simply do as they were told without being heard first. Evelyn agreed to all 3 before he finished asking. What followed over the next 19 days was, by every account from the people who watched it happen, the most focused and precise engineering work Sinclair Aerospace propulsion floor had seen in years. Mason rebuilt the coolant channel geometry from the ground up, re-derived the missing calibration sequence for the secondary thermal sensor array from memory, and confirmed it against fresh test data rather than guesswork, and did it all in the same quiet, economical manner he'd always worked in. No grandstanding, no victory laps. Simply precise, specific competence laid out one verified test result at a time. The kind of work that speaks entirely for itself and needs no explaining. Technicians who had barely noticed him during his first stint began quietly rearranging their schedules to be on shift when he was running tests, just to watch how he worked. Derek's unraveling happened almost in parallel and almost entirely without Mason's involvement, which was exactly how Mason preferred it. Confronted with the altered timestamp and the original unedited data Priya had recovered, Derek first insisted it was a data syncing error, then claimed he'd been under pressure from the board to show progress, then, cornered by Evelyn directly in a closed-door meeting with HR present, admitted that he had genuinely believed, at the time, that the risk was manageable and that he had adjusted the numbers to buy time to fix it quietly rather than alarm anyone. It might even have been true. In the small, self-protective way people convince themselves of things under pressure. It didn't matter. The board had already seen the timeline Priya assembled, and Evelyn, for the first time since taking over the company, chose to let a hard truth reach her investors directly, instead of managing it away. Derek's departure from Sinclair Aerospace was handled quietly, without public humiliation, which was Evelyn's decision and, notably, also Mason's request. He had no interest in watching another man endure in public what he himself had endured, even a man who deserved a harder landing than he got. Something else had been shifting quietly underneath all of it, unremarked on by either of them for weeks. Evelyn had started staying late on the propulsion floor, not to oversee Mason, but simply to watch him work, asking questions that had nothing to do with board updates and everything to do with genuinely wanting to understand the system the way he did. Mason, for his part, had started noticing that Evelyn Sinclair, without an audience to perform authority for, was an entirely different person than the woman who'd said do as I said or quit. Someone sharper, more curious, and far more uncertain of herself than she ever let the board see. Neither of them said anything about it. Both of them noticed anyway. The final calibration run was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 12 days before the rescheduled launch. and it would either confirm that Mason's redesign held under full thermal load or send the entire timeline back to zero with no runway left to recover. Evelyn asked to be in the control room for it. Not as CEO overseeing a milestone, but she admitted quietly to Priya beforehand, because she didn't want to watch it happen from a screen upstairs. 6 days would pass in tense preparation before that Tuesday morning arrived, and neither Mason nor Evelyn yet knew that the test itself would be the easy part of what was still ahead of them. The calibration run held. Every reading, every threshold, every number that mattered came back exactly where Mason's redesign said it would. And when the secondary thermal sensor array finally cleanly reported nominal function across the full test window, the control room didn't erupt into cheering the way people expect from these moments. It went quiet instead, the particular quiet of a room full of people who had genuinely doubted they'd get here. Evelyn stood at the back of that room and watched Mason check the same readout 3 times before he allowed himself even the faintest exhale. And she understood, watching him, that this was simply what real competence looked like. Careful, unhurried, entirely uninterested in being applauded for doing its job correctly. The public reckoning came 8 days later, at the same board table where it had all begun. Evelyn didn't need to stage it. The board had asked, unprompted, for a full account of how the company had recovered its launch window, and she gave them one, standing at the head of the same table where she had once told Mason to do as she said, or quit, and telling the same 12 executives, without flinching, that the recovery existed because of the man she had dismissed, that his original warning had been correct, that the failure had been hers for not listening, and that the incident file would formally reflect all of it. Derek's name came up only once factually, without cruelty. Mason's came up as the engineer of record on the redesigned coolant system, a title Evelyn insisted on over his own night-quiet objection that he didn't need the recognition. When the board, visibly moved by the honesty of it, offered Mason a permanent executive position with a salary well into 7 figures and a seat at future board meetings, he declined it calmly, the way he declined most things offered too loudly. What he asked for instead was smaller, and, to everyone in that room, far more surprising. A standing rule, written into the company's engineering charter, that any technician or engineer raising a documented safety concern would be guaranteed a hearing before any board or executive review, regardless of title or tenure. The same 15 minutes he'd had to fight for, made automatic for whoever came after him. Evelyn didn't just agree. She asked to co-author it with him personally, and the two of them spent an evening at her kitchen table, not his, drafting language neither of them would have written the same way 3 months earlier. If there's one thing this story keeps circling back to, it's the old, unresolved question of whether a company really belongs to the people whose names are on the building, or to the people whose hands actually keep it running. And by the end, even Evelyn Sinclair, who had built her whole leadership style around never being questioned, had come around to believing it was the second answer all along. The quiet coda arrived 4 months later, on an ordinary Sunday evening that neither of them made any fuss over. Evelyn had started coming to Mason's small house for dinner some Sundays, not as CEO and engineer of record, but simply because Chloe had started setting a third place at the table without being asked, and because Mason had stopped correcting her when she did it. That particular evening, Evelyn stood at the stove beside him, badly attempting the same recipe Chloe had been teaching her for weeks, and noticed the chipped coffee mug with the crayon family still sitting on the shelf above the sink, a little more faded now, still exactly where it had always been. She asked him, quietly, if he'd ever regretted walking out of that boardroom with nothing but a toolbox and a coffee mug to his name. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, slowly and honestly, and told her that walking out was the easiest decision he'd made in years, because the Only thing he'd ever really been protecting was already sitting at that kitchen table, flour on her hands waiting for dinner. If you've ever been the quiet one in the room, the one who noticed the problem nobody wanted to hear about, the one who got overlooked because you weren't the loudest voice at the table, I hope this story reminded you that being underestimated is never the same thing as being unworthy, and that the mug on the shelf, the family at the table, is very often worth more than the title on the door. If you believe quiet, overlooked people deserve to be seen, I'd love for you to stay part of this story with us and subscribe, because there are so many more of these stories still waiting to be told, and I'd be glad to have you here for the next one, including, if you stay just a little longer, the final quiet truth about what Mason chose to do with that 7-figure offer 6 months after he turned it down.